bring in Tom Verducci, the great baseball writer for Sports Illustrated, works for MLB Network. He'll join Bob Costas and Jim Cott to call tonight's Indians at Red Sox game at 7 p.m. on MLB Network. Tom's book is The Cubs Way. It's available in stores everywhere, and Tom, kind enough to join me here on the show. What do you think, Tom? Are you going to get the first Steve Bartman interview?
I think for full closure, he has to appear on Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Then you know the tide has turned, right? I mean, that's listen, I think like a lot of people, I've made a run at Bartman over the years. He's kept a low profile, good for him. But I think there does come a time here where people just want to hear his voice and see his face and just tell him, you know, or at least have the feeling, hey, all's forgiven. It wasn't your fault, buddy. We've moved on. Let's all move on.
What have your experience been like trying to get Steve Bartman to do an interview?
Well, basically, you go through his representative. He's an attorney in Chicago. Very nice guy. You know, I pass along requests. I did one for my book and thought I could get him for the book just to have him quoted without having his face out there, because I think he likes being, quote unquote, anonymous going around in life. So, but he's been very gracious. He's turned down many other opportunities to, I don't even want to say make a buck on it, but profit at least by his image. And everybody tells me he's the kind of guy who is the typical diehard Cubs fan. You know, lives, breathes Cubs baseball, and that was not an easy moment for him. So I think all of us want to move on, but all of us want this guy to enjoy the Cubs the way any fan could enjoy a Cub at the Cubs and not have to be so anonymous.
It's hard to juxtapose, Tom, staying anonymous and still living in Chicago. It surprised you that he stayed in Chicago after all this?
Yeah, I mean, especially being a Cubs fan, I'm sure, you know, he'd want to go to the ballpark and things like that, hang out with the Cubby Bear. So, yeah, it does surprise me a little bit. There had been rumors that he had gone overseas immediately after that. Listen, I know that night and the next day after that game in 2003, the media were just camped out all over his street. That must have been a scary proposition. And I can understand why someone would just want to go, quote unquote, into hiding, because, you know, if you're just an ordinary civilian, you are not used to that kind of life. So I don't blame him at all for essentially going underground for all these years.
Talking to Tom Verducci, senior writer, Sports Illustrated, works for the MLB Network as well, joining me here on the Dan Patrick Show. Tom, the Dodgers probably didn't need You Darvish, but how much better did they get with You Darvish?
I actually argue that they did need him because, I mean, listen, they're like the 84 Tigers this year, just completely boat racing their league. That doesn't mean they can do the same in the postseason. And when I looked at the potential matchups in the postseason environment, I'm talking about starting pitching. You go up against the Cubs or against the Nationals, you don't win any of the starting pitching matchups beyond Kershaw getting the ball. And that's assuming Kershaw comes back and is the same pitcher after missing 4 to 6 weeks with this back injury. Listen, I know they're incredibly deep offensively. Their bench is terrific. Their bullpen is very deep. But you still have to at least play the first 5 to 6 innings of the game, even with the other team. And they were in danger of not doing that without another starting pitcher. I mean, you saw that happen last year, right? I mean, they tried to get by with Kenta Maeda and Julio Urias, and they were both out of games early. The Urias game, game 4 against the Cubs, was the one that really turned that series. So now I think that they're more of a sure thing to get through the playoffs with a guy who's going to give them, I think, at least 6 stable innings.
Yeah, you go back a couple of years ago, too. Game 3 of the LDS, they had to roll Brett Anderson out there. Now they have some depth at their pitching staff with Darvish on the mound. Do you think, Tom, he's a better pitcher in L.A. than what he showed in the first half-plus of the season in Texas?
I do. I definitely do. I mean, all his metrics are pretty much where they should be in terms of velocity and things like that, pitch selection. And by the way, having Darvish there also allows them to stay away from this fatal mistake they seem to be doing in the postseason all the time by pitching Kershaw on short rest. You know, that hasn't worked out well in these playoff scenarios. So now they can use Hill and Wood behind Darvish and Kershaw if they want. But listen, I think Darvish has been affected by rumors of being on the market for this month. I really do. It happens to some people. I saw it happen to Roy Halladay. It happened a little bit to John Lester. You know, people go in there and scout the guy, just want to look at stuff. And I know he got absolutely bombed by the Marlins last week in Texas, the 10-run game. I spoke with the Marlins players. They were actually a little ticked off that people were insinuating that he was tipping his pitches. They said absolutely not. They said that Darvish was just in the middle of the plate throughout the game. Simple as that. And I think that's typically not him. So I do think the environment of having his name out there on a market for a guy who's never been traded, I think it did affect him. But stuff-wise, and especially transitioning to the National League. I love taking pitchers from the AL going to the NL with that complete automatic bailout spot and the ninth spot in the lineup. Really affects how you pitch a lineup. I think he'll be a lot better in L.A.
Nationals get Brandon Kinsler, a couple other relievers as well. Their bullpen was, I think, the worst in baseball prior to these deals. Did they solve those bullpen problems this week?
Well, they're better. I'm not sure they're completely solved. I mean, the run yesterday was definitely on relief pitching, and especially relief pitchers who can miss bats. Home runs have totally changed this game. I mean, there's so many home runs in the game today that nobody was out there in the market shopping for bats. I can't remember a trade deadline where that happened. I mean, the position players traded were Adam Rosales, a utility infielder, and Tim Beckham, shortstop, and I'm still trying to figure out why the Orioles traded for him. But anyway, it was all about getting power arms. There's enough of them in the game, but really loading up on power arms. The top 7 bullpens in Major League Baseball all added relief pitchers in July. That's where the game is at. And you saw it last year in the postseason with Cleveland, the way they could just really hold a game from the 6th inning on with keeping the ball out of play. So Kinsler, to me, is a good addition because they simply needed better, more reliable arms. But he's a ground ball pitcher. He's not a strikeout pitcher. The ball's going to be play against him. I still don't think they match up against the Dodgers, and they could certainly prove me wrong, but at least they have addressed their biggest weakness, but I don't think they've solved it.
Red Sox, Yankees, both, feels like it's 15 years ago, arms race in the American League East between those two teams. Addison Reed, Sonny Gray, which one of these teams improved the most, you think, at the deadline?
Well, I think the Yankees, because you have to also look at the additions of Canely and Frazier and Robertson. I mean, you talk about strikeout pitchers. They have 5 of the top 18 relievers in baseball when it comes to strikeout rate. It's just ridiculous. There's never been a bullpen like this that keeps the ball out of play. And now I think Gray is that missing piece for the Yankees because now they can go Severino, Gray, Sabathia, Tanaka. That's good enough to win the World Series, I think. And I wouldn't have said that earlier. I didn't think they have enough starting pitching to win the World Series. Now, I think right now they're a better team than the Red Sox. I do like the Addison Reed addition. But to me, I mean, anybody who's 35 and under has never seen the biggest spectacle in baseball, and that's Yankees against the Dodgers in the World Series. And yesterday brought us closer to seeing that for the first time. I mean, the biggest World Series audience in history, 78 World Series, Yankees, Dodgers, 44.2 million people. Now, I'm not going to get to that number, but it just goes to tell you, when you get New York and L.A., Dodgers, Yankees, with the Cubs winning the World Series, there's nothing bigger in baseball. And I think yesterday moved us a step closer to getting that. Now, of course, I mean, anything can happen in the postseason. That's the usual caveat. But at least those two teams, to me, were the biggest winners on deadline day.
Has David Price gotten upset at you recently? Because you started this, Tom. You got the rock rolling down the mountain here. It is. You criticized David Price, and he all of a sudden became very sensitive to all forms of criticism.
Yeah, he didn't like that. I think that was the David Ortiz home run he hit off him in the playoffs, and I was working for TBS and mentioned the fact that Ortiz was sitting on that pitch. And, yeah, he didn't like that. He's never said anything to my face. It's just a shame that for the Red Sox, this is still a lingering issue. I mean, they don't need anything like this where it's player-created, right? I mean, the thing to do if you don't like what somebody says, and I think David's got every reason to be mad at Dennis Eckersley. I could disagree with him, but he has a right to do that. But the way you handle it is you pull the man aside and you talk to him one-on-one like a man. You don't stand up in front of your teammates so you can look like a tough guy in front of your own guys and air out a Hall of Fame pitcher. You handle it like a man one-on-one in private. And he chose not to do that, and that's why it's a public issue. It would have been a private issue before, but now it's a public issue, and it's part of the dirty laundry of the whole Red Sox team because we're still talking about it, right? And it probably won't go away. And every time he pitches when he comes back, it will be talked about. And I think it's a shame that the entire team now has to carry that baggage.
Always great to catch up with you, Tom. I appreciate the time.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
That's Tom Verducci, senior baseball writer, Sports Illustrated, MLB Network. He'll join Bob Costas, Jim Cott to call tonight's Indians at Red Sox game, 7 p.m. on MLB Network, plus Tom's book. I've read it. It's terrific. The Cubs Away. It's available in stores everywhere.
The Dan Patrick Show, weekday mornings on Audience.